Jamie. So I was having a bit of a chat with Isabel before this, and I've got to say I'm pretty impressed by the way she's thinking and talking about some of these issues. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. As far as I'm aware, the Snowy Rivers environmental flows was one of the first dedicated environmental water projects in this country. And considering that our environmental water management is often viewed internationally as some kind of best practice, which may seem difficult to understand if you're dealing with all the day-to-day issues, but at least we manage it intentionally. I'm really looking forward to Isabel's presentation. So Isabel, do you want to kick it off, please?
No problem at all. I will just share my screen. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you, Dylan and Jamie, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. So hi, I'm Isabel. I'm an undergraduate student at the Australian National University, and I primarily study in the Fenner School of Environment and Society. In 2020, Professor Jamie Piddock and I undertook research on an agreement to return environmental water to the Snowy River. This research has since been published in the CSIRO Marine Freshwater Journal. And I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to you about this research today. So firstly, what relevance does research on the Snowy River have for conversation on wetlands? Firstly, under the Ramsar Convention, inland rivers can be classified as a wetland, and the Snowy River is protected under the Heritage Rivers Act in Victoria. And in addition, there are a broad range of floodplain and estuarine wetlands in its lower reaches, where some of these high value wetlands are recognised in the Australian Directory of Important Wetlands. So although my research did not specifically focus on the lower reaches of the Snowy, any limited environmental water being released into the upper Snowy River inevitably has serious consequences for these downstream wetlands. So what I'm going to do is briefly go through the project, but before I do that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context of where the Snowy River is, in case you don't know, and how do we come to be delivering environmental water to it. So the Snowy River is in Eastern Australia, where it starts as snow melt from Kosciuszko National Park in New South Wales, and it ends in the Southern Ocean at Marlow in Victoria. So also in the Kosciuszko National Park is the Snowy Hydroelectric Scheme. So this was built in 1972 to provide water for irrigators along the Murray and Murrumbidgee system, as well as to generate hydroelectricity. Now to do this, it diverted the Snowy, the Yucumbene, Murrumbidgee and various other montane rivers into these dams. For the Snowy River, 99% of the mean annual natural flow of the Snowy River at its head was diverted into the scheme. Now, below Jindabyne Dam, where the Snowy River naturally continues, its flows was reduced to 1% mean annual natural flow. In the 1980s, 1990s, there was discussion around corporatising the scheme. And this motivated some environmental groups, including the Snowy River Alliance, to argue that in talks of corporatising the scheme, there needs to be some sort of agreement to return water to these diverted rivers, including the Snowy River. So there was a Snowy Water Inquiry to establish how the scheme had impacted these diverted rivers, as well as a discussion on how much water should be delivered for these rivers' restoration. After substantial political negotiations, the Australian governments agreed to deliver water to the Snowy River and to some of these other diverted rivers. Now, this agreement is embodied in the Snowy Water Inquiry Outcomes Implementation Deed, or the snazzier acronym, the SWIOID. And as Dylan indicated, this was an unprecedented agreement at its time to legally bind the Australian governments amongst other requirements to deliver environmental flows to the Snowy River. Now, no formal review aside from this research has been conducted on the SWIOID or limited review on its implementation. So that brings me to this project. The Snowy River Alliance brought to our attention their concerns that limited environmental water was being delivered to the Snowy despite the SWEOID and the agreements in place. So the focus of the project was primarily on the SWEOID and what was agreed and what has been implemented. So we asked 3 questions, one of them being what was agreed in the SWEOID for the Snowy River, what has since been implemented, and did stakeholders have a common understanding and expectation of what was agreed and what has since been implemented, especially in the context of the Snowy River Alliance being deeply unhappy with its implementation. So I'm going to step through that for you broadly. There are 2 sections in the SWEOID relevant to the Snowy River. These are to do with the water to be returned to the Snowy and the environmental objectives to be achieved with this water. Not specified in the SWEOID but relevant to its implementation are the monitoring and advisory bodies established, so I will briefly go over that as well. So I'll go through each of these components in what was agreed and then what has been implemented. So first stage is the environmental flows. The volumes to be delivered in the SWEOID were target volumes to be delivered in stages, and these volumes were to be targets to be delivered annually. So the first stage was the 38 gigalitres, second stage was 142 gigalitres, then 212 gigalitres, and then 294 gigalitres. Now that 294 gigalitres wasn't a mandatory target, and there were provisions to discuss its implementation, but this hasn't been discussed since the SWEOID was created. So for purposes of this discussion, we'll consider 212 gigalitres as that maximum target to return to the Snowy. Now, especially when I started, gigalitres didn't mean much to me, so for a little bit of context, 212 gigalitres is the equivalent of 21% of the mean annual natural flow for the Snowy River when it's delivered, and 1 gigalitre is the equivalent of 400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So the difference between 1 gigalitre and 2 gigalitres is quite big. The difference between 142 gigalitres and 212 gigalitres is quite a large amount of water. So that's to help. It certainly helped me visualise these results, but that's just for a little bit of context. Now, how were these volumes to be obtained and delivered? Briefly, this is a very complicated section of the SWEOID, and I do not have time in this presentation to go through every single detail, so I'll only briefly describe it. If you want to know more about it, I'm happy to discuss afterwards, or it's also in the published paper in a lot more detail. But firstly, the water to be released to the Snowy was to be delivered from Jindabyne Dam. However, it wasn't as simple as just releasing Jindabyne Dam and releasing that water that was stored there. The SWEOID stipulates that the water is to be made up of environmental entitlements. In Australia, for those of you who don't know, although I'm sure most of you are aware, an entitlement is a licence to use water, where according to the availability of water in the system in any given year, you receive an allocation of water from that entitlement. So even if, for example, I have 212 gigalitres of entitlements for the Snowy, in a dry year, for example, I may only be allocated 100 gigalitres. So that was one requirement in the SWEOID. The other additional complication was around the security of entitlements. So 142 gigalitres, that second stage target, was to be made of high security or high reliability entitlements, which essentially means there's a higher chance of receiving 100% yield from those entitlements. And that difference between 142 to 212, that last mandatory target, the entitlements were to be the security, whatever the security was at acquisition. So it's the additional complication. And the final complication is that even from those allocations, from those entitlements, there could be further reductions. For example, if water released in 1 year, more water was released than allocated, then that extra water was subtracted from the allocation for this year. So it's very brief, like I said, very complicated, but the essential thing to know is that the water to be delivered to the Snowy were made up of environmental entitlements that relied on yearly allocations. So that was those were the targets. That's how they would be obtained and delivered. Were these targets met? The short answer is no. So as you can see from this diagram, the orange line are the targets and the blue columns are the environmental flows that have been delivered. As you can see, the targets from 2002 to when this report was conducted, the targets have never been reached. The logical question is why not? One of the publicly available explanations is it took time to gather enough environmental entitlements. With 212 gigalitres worth of entitlements was first gathered in 2015. So that's one explanation for not reaching the targets. The other, can people still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The other notable point is the Millennium Drought, which ended around 2010. This meant that any entitlements that were available for the Snowy were receiving low to zero yields from those entitlements. From 2011 onwards, though, it appears that the high security entitlements, which make up that 142 gigalitres, they were generally receiving high yields. However, from that difference between 142 to 212 gigalitres, the entitlements are mainly general security entitlements, and they've been receiving very low to almost zero yield since 2011. And we believe that this has greatly impacted the ability to reach that 212 gigalitre target. So in short summary, the volume targets have not been reached for the Snowy River. Next component of the SWEOID was the environmental objectives. Broadly, they listed 5 environmental objectives: improving the temperature regime, achieving channel maintenance, restoring connectivity, improving triggers for fish spawning, and improving the aesthetics of the riverine environment. So these are the high-level objectives in the SWEOID. Have these been achieved? Due to the low flows being released, they're largely considered not achieved. The only objective considered achieved is improving the aesthetics, and this has been achieved through willow removal. However, those 4 other objectives are not considered achieved. These have been expanded on internally within New South Wales Government to be more detailed. However, there's been limited to no public reporting on whether these expanded objectives have been achieved. So again, short answer, environmental objectives outlined in the SWEOID have not been achieved. Monitoring and advisory bodies. As I said, these were not stipulated in the SWEOID. However, a monitoring body has been established internally within New South Wales Government. The main advisory body was stipulated in the Snowy Hydro Corporatisation Act, and this is called the Snowy Scientific Committee. This was to be an independent advisory committee to give advice on the timing and flow regime of environmental water delivered to the Snowy, as well as they were to report on the adequacy of the Snowy River restoration. New South Wales Government is responsible for implementing the SWEOID. This is largely because the Snowy Hydroelectric Scheme, where the water is being released, is within New South Wales and within New South Wales jurisdiction. And the most important thing to note is that there was no review trigger mandated in the SWEOID to review either the SWEOID or its implementation. So this is what was agreed to around 2002. What has since happened? When looking at the Snowy Scientific Committee, so this was meant to be established in 2002. It did not start until 2008. It was then disbanded in 2013 to be replaced with the Snowy Advisory Committee, which was a non-independent committee. However, this did not start until 2019. So this means from 2002, a total of 12 out of the 19 years had no advisory body reporting or advising on implementation. In terms of those implications, this greatly limited transparency and access to information. So that flow diagram that I showed you earlier, to create that diagram, I had to use around 15 different sources spread through different websites and reports. There was no information held in one area. And when the committee was active, it was easier to obtain this information and what was going on. So from someone looking in, this lack of advisory body has limited transparency and access to information. And as I indicated at the start of the presentation, no review of the SWIOID has been done, or a review of its implementation. Breeze through that, but was implementation of the SWIOID successful? If the target volumes are to be taken seriously, then no. But if the targets are only viewed as targets, as no minimum was defined in the SWIOID, and simply releasing water into the Snowy River is adhering to the SWIOID. So for me, this is where the human aspect enters in, because that assessment of whether the SWIOID has been successful or not depends on what you think the SWIOID was meant to achieve. So I interviewed various people from the Snowy River Alliance to government employees that were either active during SWIOID negotiations or have been involved in its implementation. And I also interviewed several involved scientists, both in implementation and its negotiations. And primarily these interviews were not to establish right or wrong, but to establish what their expectations and understandings were of the SWIOID, and whether they think the implementation has been successful. So when I explored whether they thought the SWIOID was satisfactory and its implementation, the responses across the interviewees were incredibly broad. The Snowy River Alliance generally agreed that it hasn't been successful, and they're dissatisfied with the results. One of the main points was that the 212 gigalitres was too much of a compromise, and that 294 gigalitres, that final non-mandated stage, should have been the minimum. And they largely thought that none of the environmental objectives had been achieved. The government employees across thought the SWIOID was a success. That although that 212 gigalitre target did not please everybody, it was a balanced compromise. It was a compromise based on good science, and they thought the overall agreement was a success. The scientists that I interviewed thought that the environmental objectives were too broad, in that they were hard to achieve and hard to monitor. And they largely attributed that there was no agreed vision for what was wanted for the Snowy River. Did they want a river that looked like it had 100% flow, or did they want to establish a baseline health for the river? They thought there had been limited articulation of that, and led to troubles with the SWIOID's implementation. But across the interviewees, there was a general consensus that there has been a lack of transparency, exacerbated by the gaps in an active committee. And especially amongst the government employees, they attribute that to the negative perceptions of the SWIOID amongst people like in the Snowy River Alliance. So there's general, there's no consensus on whether this has been successful or not. So that was the overall report that I did in 2020. In terms of lessons to be learnt, before I go into this, I do need to note that any criticism that we have of the SWIOID is with a degree of hindsight. As Dylan mentioned, this legal agreement for a government to return water to restore a degraded river due to hydroelectricity was unprecedented in Australia, and is one of the first examples of such agreements internationally. This was also before more generalised conversations on the impacts of climate change, and there was a general sense that they did not know the impact of drought on entitlements and allocations. So like I said, any criticism is with a degree of hindsight. However, as I've demonstrated, this agreement clearly has not reached the targets stipulated in the SWIOID, so it needs to be reviewed to see what lessons can be learnt. The main recommendation that we made in the report is that there needs to be a trigger for review and a revision of the SWIOID. This is especially important in the context of climate change. The SWIOID needs to allow adaptation to new information, especially as it seems low allocations has impacted proper implementation. And we also made a recommendation that there needs to be more transparent and consistent monitoring and more public reporting on whether the environmental objectives have been achieved, and information generally needs to be more accessible. Otherwise, it's hard to hold New South Wales Government accountable for the implementation of the SWIOID. In terms of generalised implications, in the conversation of wetlands within interviews, there were several mentions that the low flows have been linked to salinity issues in the lower Snowy, as well as limited flows for the wetlands, and a comment that there has been more frequent closing of the Snowy River estuary. So beyond, as I said, my report did not cover this in detail, but there seems to be a general consensus that the low flows in the upper Snowy have been impacting the lower Snowy. Since the report, Jamie and I have recommended to several members of Parliament, both New South Wales Government and Federal Government, to ask for an inquiry into the SWIOID's implementation and to ask for some sort of review. But generally, we hope that this research will aid in strengthening any similar agreements to ensure government accountability for environmental degradation. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Article in the
Yep. Thank you very much, Isabel. That was quite interesting, running through the process of developing it and some of the issues they've encountered. I think issues around allocation and environmental water is very relevant today, as well as setting flow targets. If you're comfortable, I'm going to open the floor for questions. I've got a couple myself. So that picture you showed in the last slide, that's just south of Jindabyne, near maybe the River Campground. I've been out there doing field research, and one of the issues there was invasive species, mainly deer and horses. Did the planning around improving the environmental state of the river incorporate other environmental concerns, maybe including things like water quality and sedimentation? Was there any consideration to other factors impacting environmental health?
Within the SWIOID, no. It was just those 5 environmental objectives. Addressing issues such as water quality and invasive species are within the expanded environmental objectives, but those were only established in 2016. And as I said, there's limited reporting on the efforts made towards those objectives. So short answer is it seems to be that they are now considering those type of issues. But as for the success of addressing those, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Okay, and then the other one is, so would you have recommendations? They seem to be relying on allocations under water entitlements to provide the flows. Do you think there are other ways in a regulatory and legislative sense, or maybe just in a direct water management sense, that they could provide increased environmental benefit through increased water flows? Do you think you'd have any recommendations for a better way of doing things?
I mean, I could have recommendations as a layperson commenting,
Yep.
but I might throw that one to Jamie only because of his more extensive experience in understanding environmental flows. Not to cop out on that response, but I think he could give a more expert advice on that.
Thanks, Izzy. Yes, as Izzy said, the SWIOID agreement was made 20 years ago, and our understanding of how to establish environmental flows and implement and monitor them has changed a lot since. And I think that this is a good reason why we should build in review windows into any environmental flow agreement or any catchment management plan. And it is one of the positive things I would say about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is that it does have those review periods built in that might enable us to incorporate more information. I think what Izzy's research really shows is, and what the scientists essentially said in her interviews, was that there were clear thresholds or triggers that could be achieved at different levels of environmental flow return that could form the basis of a value judgment as to the scale of the water to be returned. You know, for example, how much water do you need to flush the sediment that was clogging up the Rocky River channel to get back to rocky bedrock, or how much water flow and when do you need to enable the endangered Australian grayling fish to swim upstream. But the political compromise agreement between the three governments in 2002 didn't explicitly adopt any of those thresholds as the value or the environmental goal that they had chosen. And that makes it very hard then to track and monitor what's actually been achieved. And so I would say that, you know, as we're moving into a climate constrained future in places like the Murray-Darling Basin, those of us who have an interest in seeing environmental assets maintained are going to need to be more and more explicit about which ones we think are priorities to maintain with limited environmental water, but also those that we will have to triage or allow to desiccate and die because there isn't enough water available.
Thank you, Jamie, for that sobering response.
Important.
I have heard other people, maybe I won't mention, but I have heard other people talking about the need to make decisions about where we want to look after and not. So if anyone else has questions, please fire them at Isabel. It will be a painful but useful experience for her, I think. And about anything related to Snowy River, environmental water, her talk, please, we'd welcome anyone. Please just put your hand up and I'll give you the floor.
And just so everyone knows, there's a copy of Izzy's paper, Izzy and Jamie's paper in the chat, the link to that paper.
I think this is a less fun topic than
Michael,
waterbirds.
Michael Rathle's got his hand up.
Excellent. Michael, please.
G'day, Izzy, thanks for the presentation. That's but it's really interesting topic, really complex area. So I'm with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office now, but I did previously work in New South Wales Government and worked on the Snowy Water Licence there, so I'm a bit familiar with these issues, and I know it's a really difficult trade-offs, obviously, with climate risks around you know, reduced snow melt we're expecting, and less flows all around. You know, snowy water storage is likely to be less. That's going to affect industry, environment, electricity generation, all that sort of stuff is thrown in the mix here. So it's obviously a really difficult, complex area, and to open up this, you know, the SWEOID and you know, go into that space is pretty contentious and tricky. Interested just focusing on the outcome side of things, and I think it touched on a little bit about Dylan's point around, you know, are there ways of being able to get better environmental outcomes, do you think, with the water that's been recovered? You know, either using the water differently or changing operational arrangements, or I know Mwamba Weir removal has certainly been on the cards. I know that's been looked at through the Snowy Water Licence review. We didn't touch too much on the Snowy Water Licence, but that's, you know, there might be opportunities through there. So is that something you've explored much at all? And are there ways of, do you think that we can get better outcomes in the Snowy River with the water that's been recovered to date?
It's a very good question, and the Mwamba Weir, although I didn't specifically mention in this presentation, was definitely an issue that came up in interviews and also within the reviews of the Snowy Water licence. I think, as far as I'm aware, the Snowy Advisory Committee are anxious to get that issue on the agenda, especially as it allows for that connectivity in the dispersion as well as the migratory species. It does help with the high level objectives. I think that's a relatively simple outcome that could be implemented. In terms of conversations with the advisory committee, there's been sort of consistent sentiments that the complications around, I didn't mention it in this presentation, but the allocations are given 6 months before, as you would be aware. They're restricted on irrigation allocations. They're told a couple of months before they're not allowed to have them, the water. If they don't use all that water in that water year, they're not allowed to use that water the previous year. So I think in terms of with the water that they have, I think the advisory committee are looking at allowing for greater flexibility around allocations and when they can use it and when they're told, because at the moment they've sort of got their hands tied behind their back with low allocations and not being notified soon and not having that flexibility over how much water they can use in a particular year. There's been talks of if they could have it over another water year, they could do a big flushing flow because they've got that extra water that they wouldn't necessarily be allocated. So those are simple, those are probably not simple, it's obviously not simple, but the Moamba Weir and the greater flexibility around that allocation issue, I think are two sort of concrete things that could be done to improve delivery. That's without conversations of increasing water for the Snowy. That's just within what we have now. That's probably an answer that you already were aware of, but that's my general feeling on the issue.
Yeah, no, really good ideas. I agree. And I know we've been looking at this a little bit from the Upper Murrumbidgee perspective as well, which is obviously one of the Snowy Montane releases there too. And there's very little water being released. I think it's more like 10% rather than 21% in the Upper Murrumbidgee. So many similar issues there as well. Just one other follow-up. I understand the Snowy Advisory Committee are calling for new members. Would you consider nominating yourself, Isabel?
I'm not sure if they particularly want me with no water science background, but yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that one. I think Jamie might be suitable for that, but yeah, no.
Yeah, there does seem to be, looking at some of the committees around the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, a move towards opening committee membership, and I think that's a really positive step. So, you know, I would strongly encourage youth voices being included in boards like this, because I think even if you're not always going to have an immense amount of knowledge and experience, like some of the, you know, 30, 40-year-olds, people who've got 30 or 40 years of career experience in the field, I think a fresher and clearer perspective might actually be helpful in these decision-making bodies.
Generational change.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the thorn in the side, whichever way you like to look at it. But
yeah, maybe a greater action.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael, for those questions.
So we've got a question from Damien McRae. Damien, did you want to pop up and ask that directly?
Afternoon, everyone. Damien McRae, Commonwealth Environment Water Office. Really enjoyed your presentation this afternoon. It's part of my world up there. Moamba is the way I know that country. So slightly different terminology. But yeah, really curious. And I know just very quickly having a look at, and Jamie's been following this issue for a long time. You can still find media clips from when Jamie was commenting on the demise of the Independence Committee back in the day. And I'm really curious in your thoughts in terms of the conversations you've had. Is there a role? Would we see an improvement in the outcomes that are achieved if the independence of that committee had been retained? Is there something special about the independence of a group like that that helps drive and achieve better outcomes compared to what we've achieved so far?
No, it's a very good question. In terms of whether it could improve outcomes. I'm not necessarily sure I can have a definitive answer on that. In a very brief comment would be, I think it would improve public perception of its implementation if it was independent. And that's certainly the vibe that I'm getting from conversations with people from the Snowy River Alliance, that gap in an independent committee and then being replaced by a non-independent committee has only exacerbated those feelings that something's not right or it's not been implemented correctly. And I don't think that you can't underestimate the power of stakeholder approval of these type of agreements. But Jamie, you might have more of an opinion on the role of it being independent. But that would be my sort of generalised opinion on that.
It's certainly my view that a more independent committee would help. I mean, in the case of the Snowy, there's some very powerful vested interests, particularly Snowy Hydro, in terms of being a major electricity utility. And I think having that independent advice to ministers is really critical in ensuring that they have a diverse range of views to make an informed decision. The second point I'd note is that this whole topic is horrendously complicated. Izzy, I don't recall exactly how many sources of data you needed to get to show that hydrograph. It was something like 15 reports, wasn't it?
15, yep.
So, and that's delving through the bowels of the New South Wales bureaucracy. So having an independent committee to synthesise that information consistently year after year, and recall here that Izzy's only had the time to focus on the Snowy, not any of the other half dozen montane rivers that each have their own environmental flow rules in the Alps. Really, it leads me to think that there's nobody outside of the New South Wales government who's really got a good overview of what's happening, able to report that back to the stakeholders and enable the stakeholders to engage ministerial decision makers as appropriate. So I think that independence is really quite important.
And just 2 points to add to what you said, Jamie. Something I didn't mention with the advisory committee, Snowy Hydro is a member on that committee. So that idea of the common of vested interests, that's the context where that applies. And I just saw a comment that the advisory committee has 2 community members. Yes, and some of those are from the Snowy River Alliance. However, having sat on the advisory committee meetings and talked with the Snowy River Alliance, that has done nothing to pacify that feeling of it's not being implemented correctly. And there's a generalised opinion that the community members on that committee don't necessarily have an input in what's being done. They're more that gateway to put information back to the Snowy River Alliance. So it's definitely a good step, but it's there's a general feeling of dissatisfaction still with that makeup.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Isabel, and Domi, thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. This is lining up a lot with other things that I've seen around both environmental water consultation processes around environmental water. Michael, you've got another question?
Well, it's just following up on that discussion around the committee. So my understanding is the original both committees, my understanding, are independent in the sense that they're external to government, but the difference between the 2 committees is that this Snowy advisory committee isn't just science focused. The original committee was very much more a scientific committee, where this is more like one of the other advisory groups that have across the state and across the basin in many instances, where you've got science among community, First Nations, a whole range of perspectives brought to that table. So it's independent in the sense you've got non-government views being presented there. I guess there's a different question around whether those views are being properly heard and acted upon, and that's obviously where the rub is around some of these sorts of things, and whether the level of influence that those in the committee would like to see that have come to fruition is a real tricky one. I guess the other thing is, yeah, because there are so many interests and it's so complicated, often these things take a long time. Nothing's simple. And so I think that, goes to even the Moamba Weir issue. It's been on the agenda for quite a number of years. My sense is that we're probably close to an outcome there, but it's, none of these things happen overnight. So I think that's another thing to say. If you're involved in these sorts of committees, you've got to be in it for the long term and have realistic ideas around how long these things might take. Anyway,
No,
comment, not a question.
No, I completely agree with you, and that's why I didn't have a definitive answer on whether the current advisory committee is delivering better or worse outcomes, apart from looking at community satisfaction, because they've only been around since 2019. And even then, I think they only started becoming active when the report was being completed, so in 2020. So it's definitely got teething issues and just beginning to start up. So, I completely agree. It definitely does take time. I guess with this report, hopefully it highlights what the issues may be with that committee, or at least what the issues are with community satisfaction, and sort of delving into that.
Dylan, if I might jump in briefly on Moamba Aqueduct, I think it's got some interesting implications for the Murray-Darling Basin. So if that weir was decommissioned, it would leave a free-flowing Alpine River tributary coming into the Upper Snowy, which would have a couple of major ecological advantages, including enabling seasonal pulsed flows of water going down there. So the Moamba typically provides about 7% of the 6 or 7% of the Upper Snowy's inflows. It would enable nutrients and so forth to go down there and provide some reconnection for migratory fish. And so this idea of communities, governments protecting a free-flowing tributary in regulated river basins, I think is one that we need to explore more deeply in Australia. So certainly in tributaries of the Murray-Darling Basin, there are a few examples. For example, the Victorian government has protected the Ovens River as a heritage river, free-flowing, the last big free-flowing headwater tributary into the Upper Murray. But there are others, such as the Horton River tributary of the Gwydir, where I think the basin plan is overly focused on lowland floodplain wetlands, and with climate change, as a society, we need to think about protecting some of these remaining free-flowing river tributaries where there might be that potential for the aquatic flora and fauna to move upriver and adapt naturally to some of the climate change impacts. And
not to bring it back down to the Snowy, Jamie, just for those who aren't familiar with Moamba as we might be, Moamba is a tributary into the Snowy, but it's been diverted into the Snowy scheme. So none of that water goes into the Snowy River. It was briefly opened when the Sweoid was implemented. And all of that water that was considered to flow in the Snowy was considered a debt, and that was another reduction that I didn't mention here, but that was another reduction of allocations to the Snowy, was paying back that debt to the Moamba. So that's the context around it. Yeah.
So it's been re-diverted to enable a very small amount of hydroelectricity generation as environmental flows are released from Jindabyne Dam.
That's an insightful comment. Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, now's your time. Otherwise, I'll throw to Isabel for some final thoughts before going to Kyle, who will give us a bit of a snapshot of what's happening next time. But firstly, thank you very much, Isabel. And
thank you.
I've gotten a lot out of this, and I'm sure a lot of other people have. Do you have any final thoughts, reflections, or future directions? Anything that you want to pitch in at the end?
Wow, big question. I think my final thoughts is, and I think it was briefly mentioned by Michael, that this is a report just on the Snowy. But I think similar things are occurring with the Montane rivers and the Murrumbidgee River, which is also mentioned in the SWIOID. So if this is a canary in the mine, I think it'd be worth doing a review of the Montane and Murrumbidgee side of things. And that's certainly a big concern for people from the Snowy River Alliance. So if anyone out there is in that area, I think that needs to be looked at. And in terms of future directions, I don't know. I'll graduate next year and figure that out then. Yep. But I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and it was great to have so many good questions. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Kathy's just saying she'll be in touch. And I know that Jamie and someone else in his group seem to have released some research quite recently on differences between CHUO available water and used water, which I'll post in the chat. Kyle, do you want to give us a brief overview of what you'll be talking about next time?
Yep, I can do that. My name's Colin Grant. Many of you actually might know me if you're in the CHUO because I work in portfolio management. So that's pretty cool. So in 2018-19, I worked within the ACT Urban Stormwater Project, doing my honours looking at urban constructed wetlands and how seed bank germination occurred within them. So I did a seed bank emergence trial at the University of Canberra, looking at how water regime variability would affect germination over time, and comparing seed bank composition to extant vegetation community composition, and some things like that. So going from very big stuff with Isabel to some very small rivers and some small creeks with me. So yeah, I'll have a bit of yarn about that next month and hope that's interesting.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, everyone. And I like swinging between this kind of very policy relevant to some very nerdy scientific but important ecological sort of talks. I am looking forward to Kyle's talk a lot.
Mine's probably dirtier.
You probably got dirty in the process of doing the field work, right?
Yeah. Sampling urban wetlands on Sullivan's Creek in Canberra. Quite dirty. Dirty business.
All right. Unless someone from the Wetlands team wants to pipe in, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you, Izzy. Thank you. Thanks, Jamie.
No problem. Thank you.